There are tens of thousands of them, earthen mounds spread across the eastern half of what's now the United States, along the Mississippi, up the Ohio Valley, down through Georgia and Alabama, and out across the country toward Oklahoma. Some are low and worn, the kind of rise you'd walk over without a second glance. Others stand 100 feet tall, with flat summits wide enough to hold a building. For most of American history, people stood in front of these mounds and asked the same question: who could have built them? But for a long time, the answer they reached for was almost anyone except the people who were already living here. A lost race, survivors from a sunken Atlantis, wanderers from ancient Israel, or Egypt, or Wales. In the strangest versions, a race of giants. The one explanation that kept getting shoved to the side was the plainest one of all, that Native Americans built them. What you probably weren't told in school is this. Around the year 1100, just across the river from where St. Louis sits today, there was a city. It had something close to 120 mounds, a great open plaza at its heart, and somewhere near 20,000 people living in and around it. The official historic site that protects it now will tell you that at its peak, it was larger than London was at that very same moment. Its name was Cahokia, and the people who raised it weren't a vanished race from across an ocean. They were the ancestors of nations who are still here. This is what they never tell you about the mound builders. And the strangest part isn't that the truth was hidden away in some vault. You'll see, in a few minutes, that the real answer was printed in an official government report more than 100 years ago. The strange part is how hard people worked not to believe it. So the real question of this video isn't who built the mounds. We can answer that. The real question is why the truth about them got buried in the first place, and what that burial was actually for. To see how the question got so twisted, you first have to stand the mounds back up to their real size. Because the word mound does them no favors. It makes you picture a bump in a field, a heap of dirt with some grass on top. Cahokia was a planned city. At its height, it covered about 4,000 acres. At the center rose the structure we now call Monk's Mound, named centuries later for a group of French monks who once gardened nearby, never for the people who actually built it. It climbs roughly 100 feet, in 4 broad terraces, and it's the largest earthen mound anywhere on the continent. Every pound of it was moved by people, without draft animals and without the wheel, load after load, until a hill the size of a small mountain stood where there had been flat floodplain. Around that central mound, the city was laid out with a clear sense of design. A wide ceremonial plaza for gatherings and games, whole neighborhoods of thatched houses, a defensive wall of heavy timber, a palisade that was pulled down and rebuilt more than once, and off to the west, a great ring of tall wooden posts, set so that the rising sun lined up with them on the solstices and the equinoxes. Archaeologists took one look at it and nicknamed it Woodhenge. And Woodhenge wasn't decoration. Those posts worked as a calendar. They marked the turning points of the year, the solstices and the equinoxes, the moments that tell a farming people when to plant, when to harvest, when to gather. To line them up that precisely, you have to watch the sky for years, and then build what you've learned into the ground. That isn't the work of a people scraping by. It's the work of a people who'd been here long enough to know their own horizon by heart. That's the part that's hard to hold in your head. The official estimates put 10 to 20,000 people here between about 1050 and 1150. That's a population on the scale of a real medieval city, in the middle of a continent that most people are taught was nearly empty until Europeans showed up. Of the original 120 mounds, around 70 still survive inside the protected site today. Think about what that means. For its time, Cahokia held its own against the cities of medieval Europe, the ones whose cathedrals and walls fill our textbooks. Monumental architecture, planned public space, a food system feeding tens of thousands, and the kind of organized authority it takes to pull all of that off and hold it together. The only reason it isn't a household name the way those European cities are is that, at some point, people decided it shouldn't be. And you're not strange if none of this is familiar. People who grew up a short drive from Cahokia, who climbed those mounds as kids, say the same thing in the comments under every documentary about the place. That nobody ever told them what they were standing on. One of them put it bluntly, Cahokia not being taught in most American history classes is a crime. There's one more thing to clear up before we go further, because it's the crack the whole myth crawled through. The term mound builders was never one people. It's an outside label, stretched over many different native cultures across thousands of years. Long before Cahokia, around 2,000 years ago, the people we call the Hopewell were raising enormous geometric earthworks across the Ohio Valley, some of them aligned to the movements of the sun and the moon. The Park Service describes the Hopewell not as one empire, but as a broad network of different native groups sharing trade and ideas across half a continent. And the trade wasn't local. In and around those Hopewell earthworks, archaeologists find materials carried from astonishing distances, drawn from as far as the Rocky Mountains, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachians, all of it moving along routes that crossed the continent long before any European map of it existed. Cahokia came centuries later, part of a different world we call Mississippian. Different centuries, different styles of building. Lumping them all together into a single mysterious lost race wasn't a mistake of the evidence. As you're about to see, it was the whole point. So where did the lost race come from? Not from the ground. It came from a story that early American settlers told themselves, and it's worth sitting with how strange that story actually was. By the 1700s and 1800s, as European Americans pushed west, they kept running into the mounds. Big ones, carefully built ones. And rather than ask the native nations living right there, many writers, surveyors, and politicians decided the mounds were too sophisticated to be native at all. So they invented builders, a vanished, superior race, they said, who'd raised these monuments long ago, from Europe or Asia or Atlantis, or among the lost tribes of Israel. And then, in the story, that noble lost race was wiped out, destroyed by the ancestors of the very native peoples settlers were now displacing. This wasn't a fringe idea whispered at the edges. Through the 1800s, it hardened into the common, respectable explanation, the sort of thing an educated person was simply expected to believe. And the grander and more tragic the lost race could be made to sound, the better the story worked. A noble vanished people makes a far more flattering ghost to inherit a continent from than the living nations you're in the middle of pushing off it. Notice what that story quietly does. It turns Native Americans from the builders of these monuments into the destroyers of them. It casts them not as people with deep roots in this land, but as latecomers, intruders squatting on the ruins of someone greater. The Ohio History Connection, which has studied this for years, doesn't soften it. As they describe it, the lost race myth cast American Indians as recent arrivals who had swept aside the true builders. And that framing, conveniently, helped justify Europeans sweeping them aside in turn. That's the part the mystery videos leave out. The lost race wasn't a harmless campfire theory. It arrived at the exact moment the country was forcing native nations off their land, and it handed that removal a kind of permission. If the people being pushed out were never the real builders, never the rightful heirs of these places, then taking the land felt less like theft. Ohio history calls the abandoned earthworks a comforting justification for removal. Comforting to whom is the whole question. And here's the detail that should bother you. There was no evidence for any of it. No archaeological evidence, no biological evidence, no linguistic evidence for an ancient European or Atlantean or Israelite builder race. The Ohio historians are flat about that. The lost race left no trace anywhere because it never existed. The mounds had a builder the whole time. People just didn't like the answer. Now, If you've made it this far, you might be expecting the part where some brave modern scientist finally cracks the case. That's how these stories usually go. But that's not what happened here, and the truth is stranger and a little more uncomfortable. The official answer didn't arrive last year, or last decade. It arrived in 1894. In that year, a man named Cyrus Thomas published a report for the Bureau of Ethnology, part of the Smithsonian. Thomas had been put in charge of settling the mound question once and for all, and he'd started out, by his own account, inclined to believe in a lost race. So his team did the unglamorous work. They surveyed and excavated mounds across the eastern United States and mapped the whole distribution. The Library of Congress still holds his great map, the eastern half of the country speckled with red dots, every dot a mound. And his teams didn't just guess from a distance. They compared the tools, the pottery, the burial styles, and the building methods inside the mounds against the material culture of native peoples who were documented and known. The same kinds of craft, the same kinds of hands. And his conclusion, after all that fieldwork, was the plain one. The mounds were built by the ancestors of American Indians. There was no vanished race. There never had been. Sit with the timing of that. The careful, official, government-backed answer to who built the mounds was in print, with a map, before your great-great-grandparents were born. It wasn't locked in a basement. It was published by the Smithsonian, the very institution that today's conspiracy videos accuse of hiding the truth. The answer was never the hard part. Believing it was. Now, one honest note, because this channel doesn't trade accuracy for a cleaner story. Cyrus Thomas wasn't a modern hero who saw native peoples the way we'd hoped to. He was a man of his own time, with his own blind spots, and the credit for the mounds belongs first to the people who built them. But his report did one thing that matters enormously. It took the lost race, looked hard for it, and put on the record that it wasn't there. If the science was settled in the 1800s, why does the mystery feel so alive today? Part of the answer is that the mounds we visit now don't look like what they once were. And part of it is that the most famous discovery at Cahokia keeps getting told wrong. Start with what your eyes do to you. Walk a mound site today and you see smooth green hills mowed like a golf course. That tidy grassy look is modern. The grass is preservation, not history. These were engineered structures, built up in stages, reshaped, sometimes capped with layers of clay. At one site in Mississippi called Winterville, researchers think it's increasingly likely that the mounds were finished in bright-colored clay, so that one of them may once have looked closer to vivid yellow than to green. Now, that's specific to Winterville, and even there some of the details are still argued over, so don't picture the whole continent painted like a carnival. The honest point is narrower and stronger. The lawn is new. The monument underneath it was deliberate, layered, and far more striking than the quiet hill you'd drive past today. Then there's Mound 72. If you've heard one Cahokia fact, it's probably a flattened version of this one, so let's tell it properly, the way you'd actually find it. Between 1967 and 1971, archaeologists excavated a long, low ridge-shaped mound at Cahokia. Inside were more than 250 people, buried in very different ways. Some were laid to rest, with extraordinary care. Others were in mass graves, 5 of them, holding anywhere from 20 to more than 50 bodies each. At the heart of it was what's become known as the beaded burial. For decades, the standard story was simple and dramatic. 2 high-status men, one laid out on a cape or platform made of thousands of marine shell beads shaped like a bird, surrounded by sacrifice servants sent with them into death. A warrior cult, a god king. It made for a gripping segment, and you'll still hear it told exactly that way. But in 2016, a team went back to the original excavation records and re-examined the bodies, and the gripping version started to come apart. The beaded burial wasn't 2 men. The group around it included men and women in pairs, a notable number of women, and at least 1 child. That changes the meaning. Instead of a warrior's tomb, The researchers argued the burial fits themes of fertility, renewal, the making and remaking of the world. The Birdman warrior reading wasn't wrong out of malice. It was just an old assumption, repeated until it hardened, and the evidence underneath it pointed somewhere else. And the mound itself wasn't thrown up in a day for a single funeral. By the official account, it grew in stages, beginning with a tall post raised around the year 950, long before the final ridge took its shape. People came back to this one spot, again and again, across generations, to bury, to mark, to remake the ground. Whatever Mound 72 meant to them, it mattered enough to return to for a very long time. The mass graves are real, and so is the violence. One of them, dated to around 1150, held people who'd clearly been killed, with crushing injuries and other marks of a hard death. It's tempting to package all of this as human sacrifice and move on. Some of it may well be, but the researchers who handled those bones are careful, and so should we be. That violent grave might represent political rivals, or a statement of power within Cahokia itself, rather than a single ritual. The truth is, Mound 72 isn't one story. It's a stack of them, ceremony and status and violence and meaning all layered into the same ground, and the layered version is the one worth your time. And those shell beads are worth a pause of their own, tens of thousands of them, each made from marine shell that had to travel hundreds of miles inland to reach Cahokia. You'll see videos put a precise labor figure on that, exact hours per bead, an exact total. I'm going to be straight with you. I couldn't trace those exact numbers to a solid source, so I won't pretend to. What's certain is enough on its own. The beads represent an enormous amount of skilled labor and long-distance trade, poured into a single burial. That's not a primitive people. That's a society with reach. Lately, there's been a fresh wave of attention on Cahokia, usually under titles promising that DNA has finally revealed who built it. The mystery's already solved, as you now know. But the DNA angle is still worth walking through, because it's exactly the kind of place where a good story races out ahead of the evidence. Strip away the headlines, and the research itself is narrower than they make it sound. In 2014, scientists studied the teeth of 87 people buried at Cahokia, and they found that roughly a third of them, 29 individuals, had grown up somewhere else before coming to the city. Cahokia, in other words, was a magnet. People moved there from across the region, the way people move to any great city. There's a limit here worth being honest about, one the headlines tend to skip. Knowing that someone grew up somewhere else doesn't tell you why they came. The chemistry in a tooth can't say whether a person arrived as a trader, a pilgrim, a bride in an alliance, a captive, or a refugee. Movement is movement. The chemistry marks that it happened. It doesn't tell the story behind it. So when you hear that the teeth prove a peaceful migration, or a forced one, that's a plot being added to evidence that doesn't carry it. And the tool those scientists used matters, because it's the part that usually gets lost in the retelling. That study wasn't reading DNA. It was reading strontium isotopes, a chemical signature locked into your teeth from the food and water of wherever you grew up. It can tell you that someone wasn't local. It can't tell you their ancestry, their name, or who their descendants are. Those are different questions, answered by different evidence. And those two things get blurred together constantly. Somewhere in the retelling, the isotope study becomes a DNA study. The 1/3 becomes 87%. They're small slips on a screen and big ones in meaning, and once they're out there, they just get copied forward. There is real ancient DNA work happening on Cahokia. A doctoral researcher has studied DNA from Mound 72, and more is surely coming. But when you go looking for the published proof behind the boldest claims, the ones that say DNA has pinned down the exact founders, or traced a clean genetic line straight to specific living nations, that proof is thinner than the titles suggest. So this channel is going to do the boring, honest thing and wait for it. What can we say? Carefully? That archaeology already identifies Cahokia as a native Mississippian city, that many native nations today hold deep ancestral and cultural ties to these mound-building traditions. even where the precise links between a living people and a specific ancient site are still being worked out. The science is pointing exactly where Cyrus Thomas pointed in 1894. It's just arriving with better instruments. There's one more thing the lost race story needed you to miss, and it might be the biggest. Cahokia wasn't a lonely miracle, a single bright spot in an empty land. It was the largest node in a network that stretched across much of the continent. Go south to Alabama, and you reach Moundville. Occupied from about 1000 to 1450, it spread across a 300-acre village with 26 mounds arranged around a central plaza, and in its day it was second only to Cahokia in scale and complexity. Go east, into Georgia, and there's Etowah, with 6 mounds, a plaza, and a deep defensive ditch, home to several thousand people. Go west, to Oklahoma, and you find Spiro, 12 mounds and one of the most important native sites in the country, a center whose trade and religious ties reached, by one official account, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Great Lakes. These weren't isolated villages that happened to pile up dirt. They shared art, symbols, and ceremony, what archaeologists call a Mississippian world, knit together by rivers and long-distance trade in copper, shell, and stone. You can see the connection in the art itself. Across these far-apart sites, the same images keep surfacing. A winged, hawk-like being that archaeologists call the Birdman. Engraved shell discs. Copper plates worked into the same striking style. This was a society sharing not just goods but symbols and stories, over hundreds of miles, the way a shared faith or a shared art movement spreads. Now, you'll sometimes hear this network linked directly to the pyramids of Mexico, as if Mesoamerica taught these people how to build. The careful version is more honest. There's a shared system of Mississippian imagery and a vast trade web across the southeast, and that's remarkable enough without an outside teacher. We don't need to import a foreign genius to explain native achievement. That instinct, the need for an outside source, is the lost race myth wearing a new coat. Stand all of it up at once. Hopewell earthworks 2,000 years ago. Cahokia rivaling a medieval European city. Moundville, Etowah, Spiro. A continent that the textbooks emptied out was, in truth, full of cities, trade routes, monuments, and people. These mounds are the surviving architecture of a civilization the textbooks stepped around, a found one, hiding in plain sight under the grass. So come back to the question we started with. Who built the mounds? The answer was never the mystery. The answer was on the record in 1894, written in the ground for 1,000 years before that. The mystery that's actually left is the one we've been following this whole time. Why so many people, for so long, refused to accept an answer that was sitting right in front of them. And once you see it, you can't unsee what the modern versions are doing. The giant skeletons, the Smithsonian cover-up, the lost race in a new disguise. They're not curiosity. They're the same old move, recycled. They take a real, documented, astonishing native achievement and insist someone else must have been behind it. The cover-up was never a vault of hidden bones. The cover-up was a story, told for a reason, that made it easier not to see the people who were standing right there. But the part worth holding on to is the opposite of disappointing. The honest version is the bigger one. A city across the river from St. Louis that rivaled London. Monuments raised by hand, basket by basket. A burial whose meaning we're still recovering. A trade network that crossed a continent. None of that is less wonderful than a lost race of giants. It's far more wonderful because it's real and because the descendants of the people who did it are still here to tell you so. That's the thing about lost evidence. Sometimes it was never really lost. Sometimes it was just easier to look away. The mounds were never asking who else could have built them. They were asking whether we were finally willing to believe who did. If this is the kind of history you came for, subscribe. There's more coming.